Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I am your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted and privileged to welcome a senior and accomplished healthcare entrepreneur who is also a fellow member of the YPO from Toronto, Canada, Helen Stevenson. Helen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ashutosh. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Helen is the founder and chief executive officer of the Reformulary Group Incorporated, a healthcare company. She was earlier the assistant deputy minister of health and executive officer, Ontario, for the public drugs programs. And as I mentioned, she's a member of the YPO. So Helen, let's start talking about the Reformulary Group. Tell me a little bit about this venture.
Yeah. So, I would say, our mission is really to make more drugs more affordable for more Canadians. Mm-hmm. And we do that through a really innovative approach in terms of essentially creating a subscription-based service, so a SaaS model, as is commonly referred to now, that behind the scenes, recommends which drugs provide the best healthcare value. And that in itself is based on this really extensive review of clinical data, cost data, et cetera, related to each drug. So again, our mission is really around making more drugs more affordable for more Canadians.
And is this primarily in Canada, or are you extending your scope to the US as well?
So currently we're in Canada. Some of our platforms could be extended more broadly outside of Canada, but the market here is we're still capturing more of the market. And so this is our focus, but there's certainly some of our products could definitely go international.
Amazing. And, you also, were, if I can use the term, a public servant. What made you give up that part of of life and become an entrepreneur?
Yeah. So actually that part of life was the anomaly in my life. I had previously been, I had done my education, my undergraduate here in Canada, went to Europe to do my MBA, did it there, and actually then worked in a consulting company in healthcare, and then founded my own consulting company, moved that one here. So I actually was an entrepreneur and was approached by the provincial government to do big reforms, partially because the kind of work that I had been doing in healthcare was more sort of big systems thinking, not IT systems, but rather health systems thinking. And so they really the government at the time needed someone to come in and really disrupt the system with sort of no biases, et cetera.
So, Helen, when I was reading about you, you also say that you make sense of medicine, both prescription drugs and medical cannabis. Now, medical cannabis is something which is being talked about and debated about all over the world. Tell me a little bit about what are you doing in the world of cannabis?
Right. So just to frame that a little bit. So again, our sort of original product is this big drug formulary. We sell access on a subscription basis. And through that, we work with different medical experts. And it was really actually through our customers. So our customers being large and small Canadian companies, associations, unions, et cetera, they started to ask us what to do about medical cannabis. And it was sort of the timing here in Canada with respect to medical cannabis was you could get an authorization and you could get access to it, but the legalization of recreational cannabis was sort of on the horizon at the time. And so as a result, a lot of employees, a lot of Canadians were asking, we hear about medical cannabis, what should we do? So we thought, well, what do we do? What is our expertise? It's really doing these massive reviews and sort of making sense of the evidence, making sense of medicine. So we put together a group of physicians that were real experts in authorizing cannabis. And we started to look at the whole medical market. Medical cannabis is much, in some ways, much more complex, than prescription drugs, because prescription drugs, we know the clinical trials they go through. We know the standard of evidence, for instance, what's required to get approved. And on the medical cannabis side, it's really not like that. It's not a specific brand that is being tested per se, but it's a specific strain, for instance. And strains can have the same name and all be different. And so it was very complex. So just quickly, we set out then to look at the evidence worldwide. So that is one sort of very unique part of medical cannabis, is that there's no one country really, at the time at least, that it was sort of ahead in terms of clinical evidence. And so we looked worldwide at studies and really narrowed in terms of what medical conditions and symptoms, because cannabis treats a symptom. It does not cure a medical condition. And so we looked at the symptoms and then built out a platform where people could go in and put in their condition and symptoms and get information or a recommendation with respect to what they could try. So it was really, again, to try to, again, along that theme of making sense of medicine, in this case, cannabinoid-based medicine.
Yeah. And, one of the things that is often debated, I was speaking to someone else who's in the business of cannabis, and I was asking them that while I appreciate the fact that cannabis is good for medical purposes, how do you determine or make sure that it is not misused? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think it's hard. I think it's difficult because now we can get, now the sort of back when we developed it, we still did have these two medical streams and recreational streams.
Yeah.
When the recreational, marijuana got legalized, over the past few years, people now that were taking medical products, many people just now reverted to the recreational because it's more accessible, it's sometimes less expensive, et cetera. And so you ask an excellent question because it's become more difficult. And so it's more difficult. And there's also the way, at least in Canada, medical cannabis is dispensed. There are organizations out there that get, that are, I'll say, independent clinical, but they get incented by, cannabis licensed producers. And so that kind of, I would argue, muddies the waters a little bit. It takes a little bit of the independence away from the dispensing of medical cannabis. So it really, I think, is taking a step back and really seeking out physicians who are specialized. Right. And again, how much THC and CBD, which are two of the, key components of cannabis, and starting sort of from the actual ingredients and then making decisions.
Fascinating. You also say that, you're working towards making drugs more affordable. And therefore, I'm assuming that one of the things that you're working on is more generic medicines.
So generic medicines feature very prominently. It's also with respect to, the way that we managed our big drug list is, again, looking at the clinical data, and that is the most important, but then looking at the cost effective. And something, and I think this is, a theme around the world, but, something I often say here in Canada is a lot of Canadians think that when they leave their doctor's office with a prescription, that's the only drug that treats their medical condition. And it's usually the complete opposite. Usually there are many medications to treat a specific condition. It's just that in Canada, at least, Canadians didn't know that. Physicians don't necessarily have access to all of that information. And so as a result, you have these, sort of prescribing where it's often sort of one specific drug. What we did then in these big clinical reviews is looking at all of that and saying, for drug A, here's drug B, C, D, E that work just as well and cost less. So therein is making more affordable. We also try to, negotiate lower prices on the cost of drugs. And we're also then moving into a space that you're very familiar with in the pharmacy space around trying to build, partnerships with pharmacy to, again, try to make drugs more affordable.
That's amazing. One of the problems we face in India is that in pharmacies, we are only permitted to fill a prescription, which means that if a doctor has written a branded medicine, we have to give that same medicine. It cannot be substituted. Which result in, if you want a simple little salt combination, you would end up keeping 20 different varieties of the same product, which leads me to my next question, which is that most people I have spoken to in my part of the world, the government is struggling to get doctors to write the salt and not the brand.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So, and we would call that salt the sort of the active ingredient. So so first of all, I didn't know that. So that's very interesting. Thank you. So here in Canada, pharmacists have the prescribing authority to substitute the generic for the brand. So they're allowed to substitute the active ingredient, right? It's based on the active ingredient. I mean, I think this is one of the most, I'm going to characterize it as the easiest way to sustainability and to affordability around drugs with respect to allowing the pharmacist to substitute that generic for the brand. Because I don't know sort of your generic, like sort of the whole pricing in Canada. And this was part of the work I did in government, right? The pricing of generics and brand, I'll say historically, I don't really quite know why we did this decades and decades ago, but it's actually tied to the price of the brand. So it's a percentage of the brand price. But nowadays here in Canada, generics might be 10% of the price of the brand. Correct. And so you can imagine, right, how affordable then generic drugs are. Absolutely. So I think that is, to your point, one of the sort of, if I can, dare I say, easiest, opportunities to be able to make drugs more affordable. And then on the other side, as it relates to this idea of brands, again, there's multiple brands, right? Some of which may be less expensive, and we really need to put that information in the hands of consumers.
So, we have another very interesting development in our pharmacy business or in the pharmaceutical world. When there was restriction to generics, the large pharmaceutical companies thought that this was a great opportunity to get in with what they now call a branded generic.
We have those two.
Branded medicine, a branded generic, and a generic.
Yeah.
And the factor could be as much as 10%, 30%, and 100%. So.
Yeah, they're called authorized generics here. Yes, so I completely understand about that. I mean, okay. I guess it would be fine if it was the same price, but really. I mean, like in India, right? This sort of whole idea of you have a patent for this long and that protects your pricing in the market, and then generics. I mean, generics are a vital part of making medicines more affordable.
Absolutely. The other point I wanted to get your thoughts on is the cost of medicines. I know in the Western world, your market, the US, large parts of Europe, prices are completely going out of line. What are your thoughts on managing these prices?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would sort of take it back to this idea of where possible, looking at, are there alternatives that work just as well? And so the drugs that are much more expensive, right, that perhaps they're not covered by, plans. The other side, though, I suspect what you're also referring to are these more what I call specialty drugs. So drugs that treat rare diseases, that treat sort of cancer, that treat multiple sclerosis, so conditions like that. And those are, I mean, it is a real dilemma. I will say, just before this call, I was on the call with a physician around. We handle some requests, specialty requests for different plans, and this particular one is for a drug that's about $1 million per person per year. So, to your point, there's even drugs that are more expensive than that. These are, I think these, at least here in Canada, governments are going to need to step in and pick up the cost of these drugs, because the other dynamic, the inequity, let's say, from different plans, be them private sector plans, so employers that cover versus governments. I mean, that's just not sustainable, that kind of, I mean, we're a small company. We have a plan that just couldn't sustain a claim like that. So I think it's also certainly around narrowing in the people that will achieve, let's say, the greatest benefit, which, again, raises its own sort of, I know some people, might challenge that, but we have to find a way to be able to bring them down and maybe allow some of these more, authorized, not quite generics, but biosimilars, right, of these biologics in. I'm certainly interested in how you're, handling that too, because it's really, really.
We have a very strong government, and there is a law called the Drug Price Control Order, and they just keep reducing the margins that pharmaceutical companies can charge. So that is one part of it. But we have another challenge in India. I'm not sure if you have faced it, and that is that almost 30% of the medicines that are sold in markets in this part of the world are what you would call fake, or underpowered. Have you faced something similar? And if so, what have you done about it?
We haven't really. I think there might be, I mean, you could probably count on one or two hands the cases of that. So we haven't. I suspect it's partially sort of our regulatory bodies, but also I'll call it the supply chain integrity that is in place here. And I suspect that's a big reason, not to mention the sort of local pharmaceutical companies. I suspect that's a big reason for the fact that we haven't seen, a real emergence of that.
Also, the general view seems to be, when I read articles, that a lot of the medicines to the US are finding their way through Canada. Have you?
You mean fake medicines?
No, all kinds of medicines. Because
all kinds of medicines. Yeah, it's interesting. So, what's interesting is, and when I was in government, we did a huge review of all of this, is the pricing of generics in Canada is much, much higher than the US, but the pricing of brands is lower than in the US.
Correct.
Now, some of that reason is in the US, they allow direct-to-consumer advertising. That is not allowed in Canada, although companies seem to be trying to get around it with all sorts of, jingle ads of drug names, for instance. But I was actually not aware that the stat that the majority of drugs coming through Canada, that sort of surprises me. But again, I wasn't aware of that.
Fair enough. So let's move on, Helen, and talk a little bit about the app and the platform that we spoke about right in the beginning of our conversation. One is your Drug Finder app, and the other is the Cannabis Standard platform. Tell me a little bit about what these platforms and apps are for.
Sure, I'd love to. So our Drug Finder app, when we built this big drug list, or formulary as it's called, many years ago, and we built in this advice with respect to, for this drug, these are the alternatives, we kind of sat back, a colleague and I, and thought, well, how will people figure that out? So how will they figure it out is that we'll put it in an app, and it's a desktop tool, et cetera, and we'll literally put it so that you could enter a drug name, and you can search all the alternatives that work just as well, but cost less. And so that's what Drug Finder essentially is. It's updated every month, and it has become, I'd say, a sort of an incredibly valuable tool for people wanting to know what alternatives there are. And so we are now really looking at expanding that to, any Canadian across the country, not just Canadians subscribe to our drug list. And similarly, Cannabis Standard was, it was a slightly different, but the same goal in terms of summarizing the evidence and putting that evidence in a tool that was accessible to Canadians. So they go in, they tick off their medical condition, they identify their symptoms, and the platform then is really from the algorithms pulling from where there's good quality evidence to consider using medical cannabis. And so they're sort of a slightly different, but the same goal of providing those recommendations.
So what I'm understanding, unless I'm wrong in understanding this, is that these are more information-related apps rather than an e-commerce app, is it?
Yes. The Drug Finder one, we're actually moving in the direction of making it an e-commerce app. Okay. So connecting it to a pharmacy. So you're in the app, you say up that alternative, and you head to the pharmacy, essentially, the digital pharmacy.
Very interesting.
Yes.
So let's move on now, Helen, and talk a little bit about a few questions for you personally, because my audience loves to get to know my guest a little better. So let me start by asking you that, studied in Canada, in Europe, have done some amazing works in your career, worked in the government, now an entrepreneur. What would you say are 3 key milestones in your life or your career?
Yeah. I would say I'll put even as number 1 is, managing a demanding career and raising 3, I'll characterize them, I'm biased, generous, smart, and honest children as a single mom. So I was a single mom for 10 years. I was the sole supporter of my kids. And, their dad was somewhat involved, but I was the sole supporter. So that is probably one of my major milestones, is getting my kids, right, to a point through their education, et cetera.
Right.
Another one, equally as important, is delivering $1.5 billion of savings to the Ontario government, in other words, taxpayers.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really as a result of these, I would characterize them as very ambitious. They were also controversial. We had a lot of unhappy stakeholders,
Mm-hmm.
but ambitious and controversial reforms that we brought forward to the government and which they embraced in whole and implemented. And that also, sort of despite threats to my personal security during that time, because we had very upset stakeholders that were corporations. And so my personal security was threatened a number of times. So that's certainly, I'd say, a key milestone for me. That was a big step, leaving a successful consulting practice, going in there. But I just knew this was a tremendous opportunity for me and would be a real milestone.
Amazing. Yeah.
And then I'd also say founding Reformulary Group in a, what at the time was sort of, I'll characterize it a bit as an old-fashioned industry, and being able to really disrupt it and bringing a new approach, right, to drug plans that provides better value.
Amazing, amazing. So I have time for two more questions for you.
Yes.
My next question, Helen, is who or what inspires you to keep doing so many different and amazing things?
So, I'd say my own sort of energy to want to be, to learn more. I'm very hungry to learn, to read, to experience things. And then I'd say there are a number of people around me, and, several of which are other women who really inspire me, be it, sort of hardships they may have come with or success that they've achieved that was, has been really deserving. So that's certainly, I'd say, what really inspires me.
Amazing. And my last question to you, and this is for the many, many people who will listen to our conversation. What would you say are 3 lessons you would like our viewers and listeners to take away from our conversation?
Yeah. So first of all, I'd say be fearless. So for most of my life, I've been a risk taker. And that said, my entire family is risk averse. My parents were, my brother, but I was the one who, went to a university where sort of I was the only one from my school, went overseas, arrived in Belgium with a suitcase and nowhere to live, and, left a role to go to government and left government to found this. So I'd say to people, be fearless. You do need to, certainly consider risk. Be resilient. Yeah. So resilience, right? Entrepreneurs need resilience to build a business. Yeah. And be authentic. So be transparent with your intentions, right? Really demonstrate value-driven behaviors. And I would say, and I may be going to lean into being a woman, but authentic leadership also means you can show your emotions.
Correct.
And I think that can be a very empowering, and really show authenticity to your colleagues, to your audience, to your family.
Very well said. Very well said. And on that note, Helen, be curious, be fearless, be resilient, be authentic, and be emotional. Thank you so much for speaking to me. Thank you for talking to me about your incredible journey, about the Reformulary Group and the way you are configuring and growing the business. Thank you for talking to me about both your app, Drug Finder app, and the Cannabis Standard app. And thank you for sharing some insights into your own life and your own journey. Thank you again, and good luck.
Thank you very much. It was an absolute pleasure to speak with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website, www.tbcy.in, to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.